Daniel had chosen the far edge of the colony because he liked silence and space. He had always been a man who preferred the whisper of wind through the broken hills over the chatter of crowded streets. When the supply shuttle left him a month's worth of rations and flew back into the sky, he often felt like the only soul on this lonely world. He was used to it, and he thought nothing could surprise him anymore until the day he found the cub. It was evening, when he noticed the smoke on the horizon. He thought it might be raiders or maybe a crashed survey craft. He took his rifle, slung it across his shoulder, and walked toward the thin trail of ash curling up into the orange sky. As he came closer, he saw twisted metal scattered across the dirt, a wrecked ship broken into pieces by impact. Some parts still glowed from the heat, and he smelled burnt fuel mixed with sharp metallic tang. He moved carefully, scanning for survivors or threats. Then he heard it, a soft sound almost too small to belong in such a ruin. A whimper, a cry that made him pause. He stepped over a shattered panel and looked inside the remains of the cabin. There, among the twisted beams, sat a tiny creature, trembling under the shadow of a broken console. Its skin shimmered faintly under the setting sun colors, shifting between pale silver and soft blue. Its large eyes glowed like polished gems, wide with fear. The creature could not have been more than a few weeks old. Daniel froze, rifle halfway raised, not knowing if this was a danger or not. The cub let out another weak cry and collapsed against the metal as though the strength had left its little body. Daniel's instinct overcame his caution. He lowered the rifle and crouched. He whispered gently, though he knew the creature would not understand words. Easy now. Little one, I am not going to hurt you. The cub blinked at him. Its chest rose and fell too fast. He saw cuts across its skin, and he noticed the faint mark of a brand or tattoo near its shoulder, though he could not read the symbols. He reached out slowly, letting the cub sniff his hand. It shivered but did not pull away. Daniel lifted it carefully, cradling it against his chest. It was lighter than he expected, and it pressed weakly against him, seeking warmth. He looked around the wreckage, searching for others, but the ship was silent. The rest of the crew or family must have perished or fled. He carried the cub back to his dwelling, his boots crunching against gravel while the alien sky grew dark with stars. That night he sat by the small fire in his cabin, the cub wrapped in a blanket beside him. He fed it drops of water from a flask, and it drank with desperate need. He cut a strip of dried meat, softened it, and offered. The cub hesitated, then nibbled, chewing with surprising sharp teeth. Daniel chuckled quietly. It seems you want to live after all. He decided then and there he would not abandon this helpless thing out in the cold wasteland. The next morning, he walked to the nearest outpost, a cluster of prefab shelters where a few colonists traded and talked. He asked the medic if she had ever seen such a creature. She frowned and shook her head. Her voice carried a warning. I would be careful. Daniel, raising an unknown alien young one is risky. Could carry sickness, could be dangerous. He only nodded and thanked her, but inside he had already chosen. He was not going to leave the cub to die. As days passed, the cub grew stronger. Daniel named her Lyra, after the constellation he often watched at night. Lyra followed him everywhere, padding across the floor with quick steps. She chirped in strange tones, sometimes almost like words. Daniel laughed at her attempts and felt a warmth he had not known for years since the loss of his family. She filled the silence of his lonely world with life. But others in the colony began to whisper. They saw Lyra's unusual eyes, the way they gleamed in the dark. They noticed how quickly she learned simple tasks, like fetching tools or mimicking Daniel's actions. Some thought she was cleverer than most human children. One neighbor muttered that Daniel was foolish to keep her. Another warned that creatures like that might bring trouble. Daniel only smiled thinly and kept Lyra close one evening as he repaired the fence. Lyra crouched low, ears twitching. Daniel followed her gaze and saw a wild beast slinking near the perimeter. The predator was larger than a man with rows of sharp tusks. Daniel reached for his rifle, but Lyra moved first. With a shrill cry, she leapt between Daniel and the beast. Her small body glowed faintly and the air vibrated with strange energy. The beast halted, snarled, then turned and fled into the hills. Daniel stared, his Rifle frozen in his hands, Lyra trotted back to him, tail swishing as though nothing had happened. He knelt, touched her head, and whispered, "What are you, little one?" that night as the fire crackled and Lyra slept by his side. Daniel felt unease beneath his affection. He had saved her, but perhaps she was not just an ordinary cub. Perhaps her story was far greater than the ruins of a crashed ship. He did not know that across the stars, an Empress still mourned the disappearance of her beloved companion, lost long ago. He did not know that the choice he had made in kindness would soon bring the eyes of an empire to his lonely world. Weeks passed, and the cub called Lyra began to grow quickly. Daniel had expected her to remain small and fragile, but she stretched taller each day, her limbs becoming strong and her eyes shining with a sharp intelligence that unsettled those who watched. She followed Daniel through the fields when he worked, carrying small tools in her hands and setting them where he needed them. She learned by watching, and soon she was able to light the lamps, prepare kindling, and even mimic his movements when he repaired machines. Daniel often paused to stare at her, wondering how fast she learned and how much she truly understood. At night, when the fire crackled and the sky turned silver with distant stars, Daniel would tell her simple stories of Earth. Though he knew she did not understand the words, he spoke of forests, of oceans, and of animals that once roamed his home world. She would tilt her head, eyes glowing, and make soft sounds as if she listened deeply. Sometimes she repeated noises back to him, and he could not shake the feeling that she was trying to answer. One night she placed her small hand on his chest and looked into his eyes with such focus that Daniel felt she understood every word. The colony, however, did not share his wonder. They watched from a distance, murmuring to each other about the strange creature in Daniel's care. Farmers in the trading post avoided coming too close. Children peeked around corners, but their parents pulled them away. Daniel did not blame them. Fear was natural when faced with the unknown. Still, he kept Lyra close to him, refusing to give her up. One day a neighbor approached and warned him firmly, "Daniel, you are raising trouble here. That thing is not natural. When the authorities learn you are hiding it, they may come for you." Daniel only shook his head and replied quietly, "She is mine now, and I will protect her." The neighbor left muttering that Daniel was a fool. Despite the whispers, Daniel felt a bond growing stronger each day. Lyra would curl against him when storms rattled the roof, her warmth steady against the chill. She laughed in short, high sounds when he played with her, tossing small stones for her to catch. She even began to copy words, repeating them slowly until they shaped into rough human speech. The first time she said the word father, Daniel froze in shock. Then tears filled his eyes and he pulled her close, whispering, "Yes, I am here always." Her talents, however, grew beyond simple speech. One afternoon, while Daniel was checking the outer fence, Lyra touched a broken post. Her eyes glowed, and for a brief moment, the post vibrated, then fused back together as though the break had never happened. Daniel stared, mouth dry. Lyra blinked at him innocently and said, "Fixed." He realized then that she carried power unlike anything he had seen. This frightened him, but it also deepened his resolve to keep her safe. The colony became more uneasy. Rumors spread that the cub was dangerous. Some claimed she had cursed their machines or frightened their livestock. Others whispered that Daniel was a madman controlled by an alien beast. Daniel ignored them, but he noticed how the glances grew sharper and how conversations fell silent when he entered rooms. Lyra seemed to sense it too, for she clung closer to him, her bright eyes wary of strangers. One evening, raiders struck the edge of the colony. They came fast and brutal, breaking through fences and stealing supplies. The colonists screamed and scattered. Daniel grabbed his rifle and rushed to defend his small cabin. But before he could fire, Lyra stepped forward. Her small frame glowed with energy. Her voice rose in a strange cry that shook the air. The raiders stumbled, clutching their heads as the ground trembled beneath them. Daniel fired into the sky to drive them away, but he knew it was Lyra who had broken their attack. After the battle, the colonists gathered, some thanking him, but more of them staring at Lyra with fear. They whispered about the strange force she had unleashed. Daniel felt the weight of their suspicion pressing down on him, but When he looked at Lyra standing proud at his side, he knew he could never abandon her. Later that night, as the fires of the raid smoldered, Daniel sat with Lyra beside him. He spoke softly. "You saved us today, but now they will fear you more than ever." Lyra leaned against him and whispered in her rough human words, "Father safe." Daniel closed his eyes, torn between pride and dread. He wondered what Lyra truly was and why fate had brought her to him. He could not know that far across the stars the loss of a single cub had left an Empress grieving and searching. He could not know that whispers of Lyra's survival would soon reach ears that commanded fleets. For now he only knew that Lyra was his daughter, in all but blood, and that whatever storm might come, he would stand by her side always. The weeks that followed the raid changed everything in the colony. The people no longer saw Lyra as just a strange cub. They now whispered about her as something powerful, something unnatural, and maybe even cursed. Daniel could feel the stares each time he walked through the trading post with her at his side. He heard the way voices lowered when they thought he could not listen. They feared her, and that fear grew heavier every day. Daniel did not care about their fear. He cared about Lyra, who was growing into something he could no longer deny was extraordinary. She had learned human speech with speed that no ordinary child could manage. Her voice was soft and broken, but clear enough to carry meaning. She called him father without hesitation. She learned names of tools and animals, and she began to ask questions about stars, about food, about words. Daniel answered patiently, though he did not always understand what she truly wanted to know. Sometimes, when he looked into her glowing eyes, he felt she carried more knowledge than she revealed. One afternoon, Daniel took her to the hills beyond the settlement to teach her how to track animals. They moved silently over the stones, and Lyra pointed at prints with surprising accuracy. She could sense creatures before they appeared, her ears twitching and her head turning toward hidden burrows. Daniel marveled at her instincts, but he also feared them, because they reminded him that she was not of Earth and not of any species he understood. When a wild beast lunged from the brush, Daniel raised his rifle, but Lyra raised her hand. Her body glowed with a faint silver light, and the beast halted as though frozen. Its eyes widened, it whimpered, and then it turned and fled into the distance. Lyra turned to Daniel and said, "Safe, father, safe." Daniel lowered his rifle with trembling hands, realizing that she had done in a breath what his weapon might not have managed at all. That night he could not sleep. He sat by the fire watching her as she slept curled beneath a blanket. The firelight flickered across her strange markings, the faint brand on her shoulder still glowing faintly at times. He wondered again about the wrecked ship where he had found her, and what kind of people or beings had lost her. He began to suspect that Lyra was not simply an abandoned cub, but something of great importance and perhaps great danger. The colony began to turn colder toward him. A council meeting was called, though Daniel was not invited. He heard afterward from a friend that the colonists debated whether Lyra should be taken from him for the safety of all. Some argued she should be handed to the nearest patrol ship of the wider sector. Others said she should be cast out entirely. Daniel heard these whispers and felt a deep anger grow inside him, but he kept calm. He knew if they tried to take her, they would see a side of him they had never known. For years he had lived quietly alone, but Lyra had given him purpose and he would not surrender. Her Lyra sensed his unease. She often came close, pressing her hand against his and asking in her broken way, "Father, worry why?" Daniel forced a smile and shook his head, but inside his heart was heavy. He had once thought raising her would be simple, a matter of feeding and caring for her, but it was becoming clear that she was no ordinary child. She was something tied to forces beyond his world, and those forces might one day come to claim her. One evening, as Daniel worked to repair the roof, Lyra sat nearby, humming in strange tones. The air around her seemed to vibrate in rhythm with her song. Lights shimmered faintly across the room, glowing like stars. Daniel stopped his hammer mid-swing, staring in awe. Lyra looked at him with wide eyes and asked softly, "Did I wrong?" Daniel shook his head, voice low. "No, child, you are a wonder." He felt both fear and pride mixing in his chest. A week later, a merchant ship landed at the outpost bringing supplies and news. The trader was an old alien with scales that shimmered. Green under the twin suns, he saw Lyra from across the square and froze. His eyes widened and he whispered words in a tongue Daniel did not know. He approached cautiously, then asked Daniel where he had found the cub. Daniel told him only that she was abandoned at a wreck. The trader looked pale as though he had seen a ghost. He leaned closer and whispered, "Be careful, human. That one bears the mark of the royal kin. She is no ordinary pet. She belongs to a throne that spans the stars." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He wanted to dismiss the warning, but he could not forget the way the trader's voice shook. The alien left quickly, refusing to stay in the colony for long. The words haunted Daniel through the night. Royal kin, a throne that spans the stars. He looked at Lyra as she slept peacefully, and wondered if fate had chosen him for something far larger than he ever wished. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of Lyra laughing as sunlight poured through the cracks in the wall. Her joy was simple and pure, and for a moment he pushed aside the fears of thrones and empires. He thought only of the child who called him father, and who had turned his lonely existence into life again. Yet deep inside he knew the world would soon come crashing to his doorstep, drawn by the secret that Lyra carried in her very blood. Daniel could not shake the words of the alien trader. They clung to him during the day when he worked the fields and haunted him at night, when he tried to sleep. Royal kin, a throne that spans the stars. He had wanted to believe Lyra was only a lost cub, nothing more than a child abandoned to fate. But now every glance at her glowing eyes, every sign of her strange powers, reminded him that she was something far greater than he had ever imagined. Lyra, however, remained the same playful child who followed him everywhere, asking questions and repeating his words in her soft voice. She seemed unaware of the storm that might be gathering beyond the quiet hills of their colony. The colonists had grown bolder in their fear. Some no longer spoke to Daniel at all. Others crossed the street when he passed. Whispers spread that he had brought danger to them, and that the creature at his side was a curse, waiting to fall. Daniel ignored them outwardly, but inside he worried not for himself but for Lyra. She deserved love and safety, not suspicion and hatred. He resolved to keep her close and never let her see the cruelty that the colony now directed at them. One afternoon, Daniel took Lyra hunting in the hills to escape the heavy stairs. They climbed high ridges where the wind howled and the sky stretched wide. Lyra loved these outings. She laughed as she scrambled over rocks, nimble and quick. Daniel smiled, watching her move with grace that seemed far beyond her years. They found tracks of a horned beast and followed it until they reached a shallow canyon. Lyra crouched low and whispered, "Father there." She pointed, and Daniel saw the creature, grazing on dry grass. Before he could raise his rifle, Lyra lifted her hand. The beast lifted its head, eyes wide as if recognizing her. It bowed low before trotting away into the distance. Daniel felt a chill race down his spine. That was no act of fear. It had been respect that evening as they sat by the fire. Daniel told Lyra a story from Earth about wolves and how they lived in packs loyal to each other. She listened intently, then placed her hand on his chest and said softly, "You pack, Father." Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. He nodded and replied, "Yes, little one." We are a pack. Days later, a patrol ship landed near the colony, bringing news and supplies. The officers walked through the streets, speaking with the council. Daniel kept his distance, hoping to avoid their attention, but fate was not kind. Lyra had followed him into the square, and when one of the officers caught sight of her, he froze. His eyes narrowed on the strange brand upon her shoulder. He spoke quickly to the council in hushed tones, and Daniel knew that the secret was slipping beyond his control. That night, a council member came to his cabin with 2 guards. They told him firmly that the colony could no longer harbor something so dangerous and that the patrol ship would soon carry word to higher authorities. Daniel refused to surrender Lyra. He stood in the doorway, rifle slung across his back, and said coldly, She stays with me. She is no danger to you, but you will not take her." The guards shifted uneasily, for they had heard the tales of what Lyra had done during the raid, and they did not want to test her power. The council member left with anger in his eyes, and Daniel knew the fragile peace would not last. Lyra sensed his fear. She came to him that night, curling against him as the fire flickered. She whispered, "Father Danger." Daniel stroked her hair and replied, "I will keep you safe always." But even as he said the words, he knew safety was slipping further away. A week later, strangers arrived at the colony. Tall figures cloaked in dark robes. They claimed to be traitors, but their eyes lingered too long on Lyra, and their questions cut too close. Daniel confronted them and demanded they leave. When they resisted, Lyra stepped forward, her eyes glowing brighter than ever before. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the strangers fell back pale with shock. They left quickly, but not before Daniel heard one mutter words about the royal crest and the Empress's lost one. Daniel realized then that the search had already begun. Somewhere far beyond their quiet hills, forces were moving to find the cub he had raised. The whispers of the traitor, the fear of the colonists, and the greed of the strangers were only the first shadows of a storm soon to break. That night, Daniel sat awake, staring at the stars. Lyra slept peacefully at his side, unaware of the destiny written into her very being. Daniel clenched his fists, knowing he could not stop the tide that was coming. But he could stand beside her when it arrived. He vowed silently to himself that no matter who came for her, whether colonist patrols or even an Empress herself, he would not let them tear his family apart. Word of Lyra spread faster than Daniel had feared. Patrol ship that had landed carried reports back to the wider sectors, and from there whispers reached places he could not imagine. Far away in the core systems, an Empress sat on her throne, still mourning the loss of a cub stolen from her side years ago, and when her spies brought her news of a creature bearing the royal crest, she ordered fleets to prepare. Daniel, of course, knew nothing of the grand movements of ships and soldiers across the stars. He only saw the changes in his colony. Neighbors who once tolerated his presence now crossed the road and shut doors when he passed. The council no longer hid their anger. Their threats grew sharper each visit. They told him that if he would not give Lyra up, then the colony itself would. Daniel kept his rifle close and his hand always ready. He had no intention of surrendering her. Lyra, meanwhile, continued to grow. Her speech became clearer each day. Her questions grew deeper. She wanted to know about the stars, about why some worlds had seas and others only sand. She wanted to know why people looked at her with fear. Daniel tried to shield her from the truth, but she was too clever. One night, as they sat by the fire, she asked simply, "Father, am I wrong?" Daniel took a long breath and said, "No, child, you are not wrong. You are more right than any of them. You are my daughter, and that is what matters." She pressed her small hand into his and whispered, "Father always." And in that moment, Daniel swore he would fight anyone who tried to take her. But the galaxy does not stay quiet. Raiders returned one night, striking harder than before. They thought the colony weak and easy prey. Daniel fought at the barricades, firing until his rifle overheated. The colonists panicked, but Lyra stepped forward. Her body shone with silver light, and her cry echoed like thunder across the hills. The raiders screamed and fled as their machines sparked and their weapons cracked in their hands. Daniel stood among the stunned colonists, watching his daughter glow like a star. He felt pride swell in his chest, but he also saw the fear on the faces around him. The colonists had seen what she truly was, and he knew there would be no going back. The next morning, a shuttle arrived unmarked, but carrying men and women in dark armor. They claimed to be merchants, but Daniel recognized soldiers in disguise. They demanded the creature, the one who carried the mark. Daniel stood in the doorway with Lyra behind him and told them she was under his protection. They threatened him and reached for their weapons, but Lyra stepped forward with her glowing eyes. The soldiers froze as if a wall of invisible power held them. Daniel raised his rifle and fired into the air. The sound cracked across the valley. The soldiers retreated quickly, but not before promising they would return with greater force. That night, Daniel packed supplies, preparing for the worst. He told Lyra they might have to leave the colony. She looked at him with wide eyes and said, "Father, home." He knelt beside her and said softly, "Wherever we go, that will be our home." She nodded and leaned against him, trusting completely. Daniel's heart ached with the weight of the danger pressing in from every side. Far beyond their small world, the Empress received word from her agents. They had confirmed the existence of the cub with the royal crest. Her heart trembled with hope and fear. She remembered the day her beloved companion had been stolen from her chambers. The grief that had nearly broken her now after years of searching, there was a chance to reclaim what she had lost. She sent her finest fleet with orders to bring the cub home unharmed. But she did not know that the cub had grown under human care and had given her loyalty to a father who would never let her go. Back on the colony, the council held a secret meeting. Some argued they should send word to the approaching fleet and surrender Lyra in exchange for safety. Others warned that Daniel would resist and blood would be spilled. Fear ruled every word they spoke. In the end, they decided to confront him one final time before the fleet arrived. Daniel learned of this plan from a friend who still dared to stand by him. He spent the night sharpening his tools and preparing his defenses. He was only one man with one rifle, but his resolve was iron. Lyra sensed the storm approaching. She clung to him more tightly in those days, asking again and again, "Father safe?" Daniel forced a smile each time and told her yes, even though his own heart was heavy with doubt. He did not know how long he could keep that promise, but he knew he would die before breaking it. When dawn came, the colony square filled with people. The council stood at the front with soldiers at their side demanding that Daniel hand over the cub. Daniel stepped forward with Lyra holding his hand. His voice was steady as he said, "She is mine, and she stays with me." The crowd murmured, fear and anger mixing like a storm. The council raised their voices, shouting of danger and betrayal. Daniel's rifle hung at his side, and Lyra's eyes glowed faintly as she clutched his arm. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and Daniel knew that any spark could set the whole world aflame. The square was heavy with silence as Daniel stood before the council, his rifle low at his side and Lyra gripping his arm. Her glowing eyes moved across the crowd, unafraid, though she was still only a child. The council shouted again, demanding that he surrender her for the safety of the colony. Daniel shook his head firmly, and his voice carried strong and clear. "You will not take her. She is my daughter. She has harmed none of you, and yet you fear her because she is different." The colonists muttered, uneasily, some shifting their feet, others gripping tools as though they might be called to fight. The tension grew until it felt as if the very air might snap. Then above them the sky thundered, a sound deeper and more powerful than any storm rolled. Across the valley, people looked upward in fear. Shadows spread as massive ships pierced the clouds, descending with terrifying grace. Their hulls gleamed with symbols unknown to the colonists. But Daniel knew immediately who they belonged to. An empire had arrived. The crowd broke into panic. Some screamed, others fled for their homes. The council looked skyward, pale with terror. Daniel pulled Lyra close and whispered, "Stay with me no matter what happens." She nodded, her small hand clutching his tightly. As the first Imperial craft landed at the edge of the square, soldiers in dark armor marched out, their weapons gleaming. They surrounded the gathering swiftly and with precision. Their leader stepped forward, a tall figure with a crest. On his chest, he looked directly at Lyra and then at Daniel. His voice was deep and commanding. "Human, you have something that belongs to the Empress. Surrender the cub and you may live." Daniel's grip on his rifle tightened, but he did not raise it. He felt Lyra trembling at his side, though her glowing eyes never wavered. He lifted his chin and answered, "She is not yours. She is not a possession. She is my child, and I will not hand her over." The soldiers murmured at his defiance, unused to hearing such words. The leader scowled and gestured for his men to advance. Lyra stepped forward before Daniel could stop her. Her eyes blazed, silver light spilling across the square. The soldiers halted mid-step as if invisible chains held them. The leader shouted commands, but his men could not move. Daniel stared in shock at the raw power flowing from her small body. Lyra raised her voice, her broken speech ringing out, "Father mine, Daniel mine." The leader's face twisted with disbelief. He shouted, again for his men to break free, but none dared to advance. The colonists who had once whispered against Daniel now stared wide-eyed at the display. Some felt fear, some awe, but all knew they were witnessing something far beyond their world. Daniel knelt beside Lyra, his voice low. "You do not have to fight them, child." But Lyra shook her head firmly and answered, "Protect Father." More ships landed, and from them came a figure robed in silver and gold. Her presence silenced even the soldiers who had been frozen by Lyra's power. The Empress herself had come. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Lyra. Her face carried both hope and sorrow. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My lost one. I have searched for you for so long. Come to me, Lyra." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He looked from the Empress to his daughter and saw the confusion in Lyra's eyes. She looked at him and whispered softly. Father Daniel touched her shoulder and said, "I am here, child. I will always be here." The Empress extended, her hand and her voice softened. "Child of my blood, you were taken from me. You are heir to a bond that ties worlds together. You belong at my side." Lyra's glowing eyes filled with tears. She stepped back, pressing against Daniel's chest, torn between the pull of blood and the bond of love. She whispered, "Father, choice." Daniel's heart ached. He had always known this day might come, but facing it was harder than he could have imagined. He lifted her chin gently and said, "The choice is yours, Lyra. Whatever you decide, I will stand with you." The Empress's eyes narrowed as she studied the human kneeling beside her cub. She had expected a frightened man, but instead she saw one who stood with unshakable loyalty. She saw the way the cub clung to him, and the way he refused to bow even before imperial might. Her heart stirred with emotions she had not felt in years. The soldiers waited tense for the Empress's command. The colonists cowered, unsure if death or salvation was about to fall from the sky. Daniel's grip on Lyra's hand never wavered. His voice low, steady, he whispered, "You are not alone, little one. Whatever happens, we are together." Lyra's light dimmed slightly, but her resolve grew. She turned her glowing eyes toward the Empress and in a clear voice said, "No, Empress, mine, Father." Mine gasps rippled across the square. The Empress's eyes widened, then softened as though she saw her own grief reflected in the child's choice. She raised her hand and signaled her soldiers to stand down. Daniel blinked in disbelief as the soldiers lowered their weapons. The Empress stepped closer, her voice softer than before. "Perhaps there is more to this bond than blood." She looked at Daniel and said, "You have raised what was stolen from me, and you have given her love, not fear. For that, I cannot take her by force." The colonists watched in stunned silence as the Empress herself bowed, her head slightly to a human farmer. Daniel held Lyra close, his heart pounding. He did not trust easily, and yet he felt the weight of something shifting, not just in the colony but in the galaxy itself. The Empress's eyes met his once more, and she said, "This is not finished, human. The bond between us will shape empires, and perhaps it will shape you as well." With that, she turned back to her ship, leaving Daniel and Lyra standing in the square. The storm had not passed, but the world had changed, and Daniel knew the final test was still to come. The departure of the Empress did not bring peace to Daniel's world. Instead, it left the colony wrapped in a strange silence. The people no longer whispered openly against Lyra, but neither did they welcome her. They kept their distance, watching with uneasy eyes as if afraid to anger a force far greater than themselves. The Imperial ships lingered above the skies, their shadows crossing the fields each day, a reminder that the Empire's gaze was still fixed upon them. Daniel tried to continue his life as before, tending his crops, repairing his machines, and teaching Lyra the simple lessons of survival. But deep inside he knew everything had changed. Lyra, too, had changed. She asked more, Questions about her origin, about why the Empress had called her Lost One and why soldiers had tried to take her. She looked into the night sky with longing, as though she could sense the stars calling to her. Daniel answered as best he could, though. His words were simple and filled with love. "You are my daughter. That is what matters." Lyra always smiled and whispered, "Father always." But Daniel could see the conflict in her glowing eyes. The Empire did not remain silent for long. Weeks later, a message arrived projected across the sky of the colony. The Empress herself appeared towering above them like a figure carved from light. Her voice rang out to every ear. "Human Daniel, you have raised what was mine, and for that, I owe you more than I can say. But the galaxy does not rest until order is restored. I invite you to bring the child to my palace not as a prisoner, but as one honored. I would see her choice with my own eyes again, and I would see the human who has shaped her." The message ended and the colony erupted with fear and awe. Daniel knew he could refuse, but he also knew the Empress spoke truth. The Empire would never stop seeking her. He looked at Lyra, who clutched his hand, and asked softly, "Father safe?" He nodded, though his voice was heavy. "Yes, child, together safe." He prepared supplies, and within days he and Lyra boarded a small shuttle escorted by Imperial guards. The colonists watched them go with mixed feelings. Some sighed with relief, others looked on with regret, but none dared to stop them. The journey to the core was unlike anything Daniel had ever imagined. Stars streaked by the windows and vast fleets of Imperial ships moved in ordered lines, like schools of silver fish. Lyra pressed her face to the glass. Whispering words of wonder, Daniel held her close, both proud and fearful. At last they arrived at a world so vast and shining, it seemed carved from light. The palace of the Empress rose like a mountain of crystal, its towers reaching beyond the clouds. Inside the grand hall, Daniel and Lyra stood before the throne. The Empress descended from her seat not in cold majesty, but with quiet steps. Her eyes were fixed on Lyra, filled with love and sorrow. She knelt to the child, her voice soft. "You are of my blood. You were stolen from me long ago, and I feared you lost forever. Yet here you stand alive and strong. The galaxy would see you restored to your place beside me." Lyra glanced at Daniel, confusion clouding her glowing eyes. She whispered, "Father choice." Again Daniel knelt before her, cupping her small hands. His voice trembled, but his eyes were steady. "Yes, child choice, yours alone. I will never leave you, but you must decide." Lyra looked between them, the Empress with her blood, and Crown the human, with his calloused hands and steady love. Her heart ached with the weight of it. Then she spoke with clarity that filled the hall. "I am Lyra. I am of stars and of father. I am not pet. I am not prize. I am child. I choose both." The Empress gasped. The court murmured, but Daniel smiled through tears. Lyra continued, "Father always, Empress too." She held out her hands to both of them, a bridge between blood and love. The Empress rose slowly, wonder in her eyes. She looked at Daniel, and for the first time bowed, her head to a human. "You have given her what even empires cannot. A bond unbroken by fear or power. I cannot take her from you. She is yours as much as mine." She turned to her court and declared, "Let it be known, the child of the Empress is raised by human love, and this bond will shape the galaxy." From that day, Daniel and Lyra were no longer hunted. Instead, they were honored. The Empress gave Daniel a place near her court, though he chose to live simply, tending gardens and teaching Lyra about both Earth and the stars. Lyra grew into a figure both feared and loved across the Empire, not as a pet, but as a daughter of two worlds. She carried the wisdom of her alien blood and the strength of her human father, and wherever she went, she reminded all who listened that love was stronger than fear. Daniel never stopped calling her his child, and Lyra never stopped calling him father. The galaxy might have seen her as a symbol of power, but for the two of them nothing changed. When storms passed and stars burned, they sat together by the fire, speaking of home, of loyalty, and of family. The Empress herself often visited, not as ruler, but as kin. And the strange pact they had formed, became the heart of a new bond between species. And so the story of a lonely man and an abandoned cub became the story of an empire changed forever. A human who refused to surrender his love had stood against fear and fleets, and in doing so had given the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Years later, the story of Daniel and Lyra had spread across countless worlds, told in whispers in markets and sung in songs within the courts of nobles. The lonely human who had raised a child not his own was no longer seen as just a farmer, but as a figure of quiet defiance who had taught an empire that love could bend the course of history. Lyra walked among the stars, no longer only the lost cub of an empress, but a daughter of two worlds. She carried herself with the wisdom of her lineage and the courage of the man who had taught her to live with heart rather than fear. Wherever she went, she was asked of her power and her place. Yet she always answered with the same words, "Father," always. She never allowed anyone to call her a pet or a weapon. She was not something to be possessed. She was family. Daniel aged quietly, though he never left her side. He chose not to sit on thrones or councils, though the Empress herself offered. He preferred the fields, the quiet of gardens, and the peace of fireside nights. But his influence reached further than any crown because through Lyra, his lessons became part of the Empire's story. She grew into a leader who balanced the strength of her alien kin with the compassion she had learned from him. She ended wars not with destruction, but with the reminder that even a simple human could raise what others thought was untamable. The Empress often visited their quiet home not as ruler but as a mother, reclaiming lost years. She never tried to sever the bond between Daniel and Lyra, for she knew it was beyond her power. Instead, she came to understand that her child was no longer hers alone, but a bridge between peoples. Daniel respected her, though he never bowed. He treated her not as Empress, but as another parent bound by the same love for the same child. It was an understanding that reshaped the galaxy more than battles ever could. The colony that once feared Lyra eventually came to honor her. They remembered the raids she had driven back and the storms she had shielded them from. They whispered apologies that Daniel never demanded, and they raised monuments, not to themselves but to the human who had shown them that fear could be conquered by loyalty. Daniel never sought glory, but he accepted their words with quiet dignity. For him, the only reward he ever needed was the sound of Lyra's laughter and the knowledge that she was safe. In the end, Daniel's hair turned silver and his hands slowed, yet Lyra never left him. She remained beside him as the years passed. Her glowing eyes softened with time, but her devotion never wavered. When Daniel at last lay down under the stars, his voice faint but steady, she leaned close and whispered, "Father, always." His final smile was filled with peace, for he knew his greatest choice had not been a mistake. Lyra carried his memory through the stars, reminding all who listened that she was the child of two worlds and that no empire, no throne, no fleet could erase the bond forged in kindness. The Empress herself honored Daniel's name in her court, declaring that without him, the empire would never have been healed. And so a single act of compassion by one forgotten man had changed the fate of empires forever. The story ended where it began, not in the halls of power, but in the simple truth that love given freely could shape the stars. Daniel's legacy was not in weapons or crowns, but in the life of a child who called him father, and who carried his lessons to every corner of the galaxy. The end.